Officer Hank Stevens, driven by prejudice, arrests a black billionaire at the bank, convinced he's just caught a thief. But when the truth comes out, Hank's entire world is flipped upside down as he realizes who he's messed with. How will he face the consequences of his actions? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Hank Stevens leaned back in his patrol car, his weathered hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The streets of Millbrook were quiet this morning, but Hank knew better than to let his guard down. His blue eyes, sharp despite his advancing years, scanned the sidewalks as he drove slowly through town. Another day, another dollar, Hank muttered to himself, a habit he'd picked up over his 20 years on the force. As he cruised past the bank district, Hank felt his muscles tense. The recent string of robberies had everyone on edge, himself included. He'd grown up in this town, knew every face, every storefront. The thought of some outsider coming in and disrupting their peace didn't sit well with him. Hank's radio crackled to life. "All units be advised, we've had reports of suspicious activity near First National Bank." 10-4, Hank responded, his heart rate picking up. He turned down Main Street, his eyes darting from one side to the other. The quaint storefronts that usually brought a smile to Hank's face now seemed like potential hiding spots for criminals. He noticed Mrs. Johnson watering the flowers outside her bakery and gave her a quick wave. Even in times like these, it was important to keep up appearances. As Hank approached the bank, he slowed the car to a crawl. Everything looked normal at first glance, but something felt off. Years of experience had honed Hank's instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him. He parked the car and stepped out, adjusting his belt as he surveyed the area. The morning sun was warm on his face, a stark contrast to the chill running down his spine. "Morning, Officer Stevens," called out Tom, the bank's security guard, from his post by the front door. Hank nodded in response, his eyes never stopping their constant scan of the surroundings. "Everything okay here, Tom?" "Quiet as a church mouse, sir," Tom replied with a grin. Hank wasn't convinced. He walked a slow circle around the bank, noting every detail. A discarded coffee cup in the alley. A car he didn't recognize parked across the street. Little things that most people wouldn't notice, but to Hank, they were potential clues. As he completed his circuit, Hank felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. These were his people. His town. He'd be damned if he let anything happen on his watch. Hank returned to his patrol car but didn't start the engine. Instead, he sat there, watchful and ready. The robberies had shaken the town's sense of security, and Hank was determined to restore it. As the morning wore on, he remained vigilant, a silent guardian of Millbrook's peace. Hank's eyes narrowed as he watched the tall black man approach the entrance of Central Trust. The stranger's calm demeanor set off alarm bells in Hank's mind. After all, with the recent string of robberies, anyone unfamiliar was automatically suspicious in his book. Well, what do we have here?" Hank muttered under his breath, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. The man, dressed in a crisp gray suit that screamed big city to Hank, paused for a moment before entering the bank. He glanced around, his movements careful and measured. To Hank, it looked like he was casing the joint. Without a second thought, Hank eased his patrol car into a nearby parking spot. He had a clear view of the bank's large front windows, perfect for keeping an eye on this potential troublemaker. "Let's see what you're up to, mister," Hank whispered, his body tense with anticipation. Through the glass, Hank watched as the man made his way to the teller's counter. The stranger's posture was relaxed, but Hank couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why did this guy look so out of place in their small town? And why was he being so darn cautious? Hank's mind raced with possibilities. Was this the bank robber they'd been looking for? Had he finally caught a break in the case? The thought made his heart pound with excitement and a touch of fear. As the man spoke with the teller, Hank strained to see if he was passing a note or reaching for anything suspicious. But from this distance, it was hard to make out the details. "Come on, show your hand," Hank muttered, his eyes never leaving the stranger. The interaction seemed to be taking longer than a simple withdrawal. Hank's suspicion grew with each passing moment. What was this man up to? Whatever it was, Hank was determined to find out. Inside the bank, Darius Jefferson stood calmly at the teller's counter, his presence commanding yet unassuming. The teller, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled warmly as she processed his request. "Of course, Mr. Jefferson. I'll just need a moment to prepare that for you," she said, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Darius nodded, his expression serene. "Take your time. I'm in no rush." As the teller disappeared into the back, Darius glanced around the bank. His gaze lingered on the security cameras, the other customers, the exits. It was a habit born from years of business dealings, always aware of his surroundings. Outside, Hank's imagination ran wild. His eyes never left Darius, watching his every move through the large windows. The longer the transaction took, the more convinced Hank became that something sinister was afoot. "What's taking so long?" Hank muttered, his fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. "No way this is just a regular withdrawal." When the teller returned with a large stack of bills, Hank's suspicions skyrocketed. His heart raced as he watched Darius carefully count the money, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "That's way too much cash for a regular transaction," Hank thought, his mind clouded by prejudice. "This has got to be connected to the robberies." Darius, oblivious to the scrutiny from outside, placed the money into his briefcase with care. He thanked the teller with a warm smile and turned to leave. For Hank, it was the final straw. His judgment completely clouded by his own biases, he couldn't fathom an innocent explanation for a black man withdrawing such a large sum. Without a second thought, he leaped out of his patrol car. "This ends now," Hank growled, his hand instinctively moving to his holster as he rushed towards the bank's entrance. The other patrons turned in surprise as Hank burst through the doors, his face flushed and his eyes wild with misplaced suspicion. Darius, caught off guard by the sudden commotion, turned to face the approaching officer. Hank's voice boomed through the quiet bank. "Freeze! Don't move!" Hank stormed into the bank, his face flushed with anger and determination. The sudden commotion caused everyone to turn and stare. Darius, who had just finished his transaction, looked up in surprise as the officer approached him with purpose. "Freeze! Don't move!" Hank shouted, his hand hovering near his holster. "Put your hands where I can see them." Darius, shocked but maintaining his composure, slowly raised his hands. "Officer, what seems to be the problem?" he asked calmly. Hank's eyes darted to the briefcase in Darius's hand. "You're under arrest for attempted bank robbery," he declared loudly, causing gasps from the other customers. Darius's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir, there must be some misunderstanding. I was simply making a withdrawal." "Save it!" Hank interrupted, his voice dripping with suspicion. "I saw you acting suspiciously and taking a large sum of money. How do you explain that?" The bank teller who had assisted Darius stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Officer Stevens, there's been a mistake. Mr. Jefferson is a valued customer." But Hank wasn't listening. His mind was made up, clouded by his own prejudices. He roughly grabbed Darius's arm, causing the briefcase to fall to the floor with a thud. "You have the right to remain silent," Hank began, reciting the Miranda rights as he pulled out his handcuffs. Darius, still trying to maintain his dignity, spoke softly but firmly. "Officer, please. This is a legitimate transaction. If you'd just allow me to explain—" "I said save it," Hank snapped, tightening the handcuffs around Darius's wrists. The metal clinked loudly in the stunned silence of the bank. The other customers looked on in disbelief. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. The bank manager hurried over, his face pale with concern. "Officer Stevens, what are you doing? This is Mr. Jefferson. He's one of our most important clients." Hank ignored the manager's protests, his face set in grim determination. He grabbed the fallen briefcase with one hand and Darius's arm with the other, leading him towards the exit. Darius, despite the humiliation, held his head high. "This is a mistake," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I hope you realize that soon, officer." As Hank pushed open the bank doors, leading a handcuffed Darius out onto the street, whispers and murmurs of shock rippled through the crowd inside. The scene had unfolded so quickly, leaving everyone stunned and confused. Hank led Darius into the police station, his grip firm on the handcuffed man's arm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across their faces. As they walked through the bustling precinct, officers and staff turned to stare, their eyes filled with curiosity and confusion. "Sit down," Hank ordered gruffly, pointing to a hard plastic chair next to his desk. Darius complied without a word, his face a mask of calm dignity despite the circumstances. Hank began the booking process, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he entered Darius's information. The click-clack of the keys filled the tense silence between them. "Name?" Hank demanded, glancing up from his computer screen. Darius met his gaze steadily. "Darius Jefferson," he replied, his voice level and controlled. Hank's eyes narrowed. "You're awfully calm for someone who just tried to rob a bank," he said, suspicion dripping from every word. Darius didn't rise to the bait. He simply sat there, his hands folded in his lap, saying nothing. Frustrated by Darius's silence, Hank leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. "Look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Just confess, and maybe we can cut you a deal." Still, Darius remained quiet, his eyes fixed on a point just over Hank's shoulder. Hank's face reddened with anger. He opened his mouth to speak again when a deep voice cut through the tension. "Stevens, my office now." Hank turned to see Sergeant Miller standing in the doorway of his office, a thick stack of papers in his hands. The older man's face was unreadable, but there was a glint in his eye that made Hank's stomach twist with unease. "Watch him," Hank muttered to a nearby officer before following Sergeant Miller into his office. As soon as the door closed behind them, Miller tossed the stack of papers onto his desk with a heavy thud. "Do you want to explain to me why Darius Jefferson, one of the wealthiest philanthropists in the state, is sitting handcuffed at your desk?" Hank blinked, confusion washing over him. "Philanthropist? But I saw him. He was acting suspiciously at the bank." Miller's eyebrows shot up. "Suspiciously? By making a withdrawal from his own account?" "But the amount, it was so large," Hank stammered, his certainty beginning to crumble. Miller sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Stevens, do you have any idea who that man is? He's donated millions to our community. That suspicious withdrawal? It was for the new youth center he's funding downtown." The color drained from Hank's face as the reality of his mistake began to sink in. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet, his world tilting on its axis. I didn't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Miller's eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "This is a mess, Stevens. A big one. And we need to fix it, fast." Sergeant Miller leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Hank. The younger officer's face had gone pale, his mouth hanging open in shock. Miller sighed, pushing the stack of papers towards Hank. "Darius Jefferson isn't just wealthy, Stevens. He's one of the most influential philanthropists in the country. That bank you saw him enter? He owns it." Hank's legs felt weak. He sank into the chair across from Miller's desk, his mind reeling. "I don't!" Hank's stomach churned. He remembered hearing about the center, how excited everyone had been about it. And now... "Oh God," Hank groaned, burying his face in his hands. "What have I done?" Miller watched him for a moment, his expression a mix of disappointment and concern. "You made a mistake, Stevens. A big one. But now we need to focus on fixing it." Hank looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "How? How can we possibly fix this?" "First," Miller said, standing up, "we're going to go out there and apologize to Mr. Jefferson. Then, we're going to release him immediately." Hank nodded numbly, following Miller out of the office. As they approached Hank's desk, Darius looked up, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the ordeal he'd been through. Miller stepped forward, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "Mr. Jefferson, on behalf of the entire department, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for this terrible misunderstanding." Darius nodded, his eyes moving from Miller to Hank. "I appreciate that, Sergeant," he said softly. Hank felt a lump form in his throat. He knew he needed to speak, to apologize, but the words seemed stuck. Finally, he managed to choke out, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Jefferson. I made a terrible mistake." Darius stood up slowly, rubbing his wrists where the handcuffs had been. "Yes, you did, Officer Stevens," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" Hank blinked, taken aback by the question. He looked at Darius, really looked at him for the first time, and saw not a suspect or a criminal, but a man of dignity and compassion, a man he had wronged terribly. I don't know," Hank admitted, his voice breaking. "But I want to make it right. Please, tell me how I can make this right." Hank stood there, his face a mask of shame and regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Darius watched him, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Jefferson," Hank finally managed, his voice trembling, "I can't begin to express how sorry I am. What I did was inexcusable." Darius held up a hand, stopping Hank mid-sentence. "Officer Stevens," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm not interested in your apology right now." Hank felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. Darius continued, his eyes never leaving Hank's face. "The damage is already done. Do you understand what it feels like to be judged solely based on the color of your skin?" Hank shook his head, unable to speak. "It's hurtful," Darius said, his composure never wavering. "It's demeaning, and it's something I've dealt with my entire life, even as I've worked hard to succeed and give back to communities like this one." Sergeant Miller stood silently nearby, his face grim as he listened to Darius's words. "I came to this town with the intention of making a positive impact," Darius explained, his voice tinged with disappointment. "I wanted to build a community center to provide opportunities for children who might not otherwise have them, and instead of being welcomed, I was treated like a criminal." Hank felt the weight of Darius's words crushing him. He wanted to apologize again, to beg for forgiveness, but he knew it wasn't his place to speak. "Do you know what hurts the most, Officer Stevens?" Darius asked, his eyes boring into Hank's. "It's the fact that no matter how much I achieve, no matter how much good I try to do in this world, there will always be people who see me as nothing more than a threat because of my skin color." Hank felt a tear roll down his cheek. He hadn't realized the depth of the pain his actions had caused. He'd never truly understood the impact of his prejudices until this moment. Darius sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I hope this incident serves as a wake-up call, not just for you, but for this entire department and this town. Because until we can move past these harmful stereotypes and see each other as human beings first, we'll never truly progress as a society." Darius took a deep breath, his eyes still fixed on Hank. The tension in the room was palpable, and Sergeant Miller shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what would happen next. "Officer Stevens," Darius said, his voice steady and deliberate, "I'm going to offer you a choice." Hank swallowed hard, his eyes wide with apprehension. "What kind of choice?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Darius straightened his shoulders, his gaze unwavering. "You have two options. The first is to face legal repercussions for racial profiling. I have the resources and the determination to ensure that this incident doesn't get swept under the rug." Hank's face paled, and he glanced nervously at Sergeant Miller, who remained silent. "The second option," Darius continued, "is to spend a week shadowing me. You'll see firsthand how your prejudice affects not just me, but others like me. You'll learn what it's like to walk in my shoes, to face the challenges and discrimination I encounter daily." Hank's brow furrowed as he considered the ultimatum. His mind raced, weighing the consequences of each option. Legal trouble could end his career, tarnish his reputation, and upend his life. But spending a week with Darius? The thought made him uncomfortable, forcing him to confront his own biases head-on. I don't know," Hank stammered, his usual confidence shattered. Darius leaned forward slightly. "This is your chance, Officer Stevens. A chance to learn, to grow, and to make amends, but make no mistake, it won't be easy. You'll be challenged in ways you've never experienced before." Hank looked at Sergeant Miller, silently pleading for guidance. The sergeant merely shrugged, indicating that this decision was Hank's alone to make. After what felt like an eternity, Hank took a deep breath and met Darius's gaze. I'll do it, he said, his voice shaky but determined. I'll shadow you for a week. Darius nodded, a hint of surprise flickering across his face. Very well, he said. We'll start tomorrow morning. Be prepared for a week that will change your perspective, and hopefully, your life. As Hank left the station that evening, he felt a mix of dread and curiosity. He had no idea what the coming week would bring, but he knew it would be unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. The next morning, Hank arrived at Darius's office, his stomach in knots. He fidgeted with his collar, feeling out of place in his casual clothes. As he stepped into the sleek, modern building, Hank couldn't help but marvel at the contrast between this world and his own. Darius greeted him with a polite nod. Good morning, Officer Stevens. Ready for day one? Hank swallowed hard and nodded. As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose. They made their way to a local community center, where a charity event was being held. As they walked in, Hank couldn't help but notice the way people's eyes lit up at the sight of Darius. It was a far cry from the suspicion he had shown just days ago. The event was bustling with activity. Volunteers bustled about, setting up tables and arranging displays. Hank felt like a fish out of water, unsure of where to stand or what to do. Darius, on the other hand, moved through the crowd with ease. He stopped to chat with volunteers, shaking hands and offering words of encouragement. Hank watched in awe as Darius remembered everyone's names, asking about their families and personal projects. As they approached a group of well-dressed individuals, Hank realized they were local community leaders. The mayor, whom Hank knew only from a distance, greeted Darius with a warm hug. Darius, so glad you could make it, the mayor said, beaming. Your support means the world to us. Darius smiled humbly. It's my pleasure, Mayor Thompson. This community has given me so much. It's only right that I give back. Hank stood to the side, feeling invisible and increasingly uncomfortable. He watched as person after person approached Darius, each interaction filled with genuine warmth and respect. A young woman approached Darius, her eyes brimming with tears. Mr. Jefferson, she said, her voice trembling. I just wanted to thank you. The scholarship you provided, it changed my life. I'm the first in my family to go to college. Darius placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You did all the hard work, Sarah. I'm just glad I could help open the door. As the young woman walked away, wiping her eyes, Hank felt a lump form in his throat. The realization of just how wrong his assumptions had been hit him like a ton of bricks. The event coordinator announced that it was time for the keynote speech. Darius made his way to the podium, the room falling silent as he began to speak. Hank listened, transfixed, as Darius talked about the importance of community, of lifting each other up and of seeing the potential in every individual. As applause filled the room at the end of the speech, Hank found himself clapping too. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, faces full of hope, admiration, and gratitude. And for the first time, he truly saw Darius Jefferson for who he was. Not a suspect, not a threat, but a pillar of the community and a force for good. The following morning, Hank met Darius at a community center in one of the town's less affluent neighborhoods. The building was modest but well-maintained, with colorful murals adorning its walls. As they entered, Hank noticed a sign that read, Jefferson Youth Mentoring Program. Inside, the main room buzzed with energy. Teenagers and young adults sat in a circle, their faces eager and attentive. Darius greeted each of them by name, his warm smile putting everyone at ease. Hank hung back, feeling out of place but curious. Darius addressed the group. Today we have a special guest. This is Officer Stevens. He's here to learn about our program and listen to your stories. Hank nodded awkwardly, acutely aware of the mix of curiosity and wariness in the young faces looking back at him. As the session began, Hank listened intently. One by one, the young people shared their experiences. A young woman named Tasha spoke first, her voice soft but determined. "Before I met Mr. Jefferson, I was ready to drop out of school," she said. "My family couldn't afford my textbooks, and I was falling behind. But Mr. Jefferson didn't just buy me books. He believed in me. Now, I'm heading to college in the fall." Hank felt a lump form in his throat. He glanced at Darius, who was nodding encouragingly at Tasha. Next, a young man named Marcus stood up. "I used to think the only future for me was on the streets," he admitted. "But Mr. Jefferson showed me another way. He got me an internship at his company, taught me about business. Now I'm starting my own small business." As story after story unfolded, Hank found himself deeply moved. These weren't just empty words of praise. These were real lives being transformed. He watched as Darius listened to each person with genuine interest and care, offering words of encouragement and advice. A teenager named Alex shared how Darius had helped him reconcile with his estranged father. Another young woman, Jade, tearfully recounted how Darius's program had provided her with therapy after she lost her mother. With each story, Hank felt a shift inside him. The Darius Jefferson he had prejudged and wrongly accused was nothing like the man he was seeing now. This was someone who had poured his heart and resources into making real, tangible differences in people's lives. As the session wound down, Hank found himself overwhelmed with emotion. He looked around the room, seeing hope and determination where he once might have only seen potential trouble. The realization hit him hard. Darius had done more good for this town, for these young people, than Hank had ever imagined possible. The next day, Hank met Darius at the Sunnyvale Rehabilitation Center, a modern facility on the outskirts of town. The building's bright exterior and well-tended garden stood in stark contrast to the gloomy image Hank had always associated with such places. As they walked through the front doors, Darius greeted the receptionist warmly. "Good morning, Mina. How's your son doing in his new school?" Mina's face lit up. "He's loving it, Mr. Jefferson. Thank you for asking." Hank watched this exchange, struck by how genuinely interested Darius seemed in the lives of everyone he encountered. They made their way to a large meeting room where a group of men and women of various ages sat in a circle. Darius introduced Hank to the group, explaining that he was here to learn about their experiences. A middle-aged man named Tom stood up first. His weathered face bore the marks of a hard life, but his eyes shone with hope. "I was in and out of prison for 20 years, he began. Drug addiction, theft, you name it. When I got out last time, I thought that was it for me. But then I found this place." Tom's voice cracked with emotion. "Mr. Jefferson didn't just give me a job. He gave me a chance to believe in myself again. Now, I'm 3 years sober and reunited with my kids." Hank felt a pang in his chest. How many times had he written off ex-offenders as lost causes? Next, a young woman named Maria shared her story. "I was arrested for shoplifting when I was 18, she said. "I thought my life was over, but the program here helped me finish high school and even start college classes. Mr. Jefferson even wrote me a recommendation letter for my scholarship application." As more people shared their stories, Hank found himself deeply moved. Each person spoke of how Darius's program had provided them with not just practical support, job training, education, counseling, but also with dignity and hope. A man named James, who had served time for armed robbery, now worked as a mentor in the program. "Mr. Jefferson saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself," he said. "He gave me a purpose. Now, I get to help others find their way too." Throughout it all, Darius listened intently, offering words of encouragement and pride. Hank couldn't help but notice the way people's faces lit up when Darius spoke to them, the genuine respect and affection in their eyes. As the session came to a close, Hank felt a deep sense of shame washing over him. He thought back to that day in the bank, how quickly he had judged Darius based solely on his appearance. The man he had suspected of being a criminal was, in reality, changing lives and rebuilding broken spirits. The following day, Darius drove Hank to the outskirts of town where a large construction site bustled with activity. As they stepped out of the car, Hank's eyes widened at the sheer scale of the project before him. "This," Darius said, gesturing to the half-finished building, "is going to be our new community center." Hank stood in awe, taking in the scene. Workers in hard hats moved about, carrying materials and operating machinery. The skeletal structure of what promised to be an impressive building rose before them. Darius led Hank closer, pointing out different areas. "Over there will be the library and computer lab," he explained. "And that section? That's going to be a state-of-the-art job training facility." As they walked, Darius shared his vision for the center. "We'll have after-school programs for kids, adult education classes, a food bank, and even a free health clinic," he said, his voice filled with passion. "This place is going to change lives, Hank." Hank listened intently, feeling a mix of awe and shame. He realized that this project, born from Darius's generosity and vision, could have been derailed by his own misguided actions. "The goal," Darius continued, "is to provide resources and opportunities for those who need them most. A hand up, not a handout." They stopped at a large blueprint laid out on a nearby table. Darius pointed to different areas, explaining how each space was designed to meet specific community needs. "We're creating a safe space for teens to hang out after school, a daycare center for working parents, and even a community garden," Darius said, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. Hank's throat tightened as he imagined the impact this center would have on their town. He thought of the struggling families he'd encountered in his years as a police officer, the kids who needed guidance, the adults who needed a second chance. "This is incredible," Hank managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea." Darius turned to look at him, his expression serious but kind. "This is why assumptions can be so dangerous, Hank. When we judge people without knowing their story, we risk standing in the way of progress and positive change." The weight of those words hit Hank hard. He realized that his prejudice hadn't just wronged Darius personally, it had nearly robbed the entire community of this amazing opportunity. Hank stood there, his eyes fixed on the blueprint of the community center. He felt a lump form in his throat as the full weight of his actions and prejudices crashed down upon him. With a shaky breath, he turned to face Darius. "Mr. Jefferson," Hank began, his voice barely above a whisper, I was so wrong. About everything." He swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "What you're doing here, for our town, it's incredible. I can't believe I almost ruined it all because of my stupid assumptions." Darius looked at Hank, his expression a mix of understanding and seriousness. "I appreciate that, Hank. But you need to understand something." Hank nodded, bracing himself for what was to come. "An apology is a good start," Darius continued, his voice firm but not unkind. "But it's not enough. It's not just about saying sorry. It's about actively working to change your mindset and your actions." Hank felt a wave of shame wash over him. He knew Darius was right. "I want to do better," he said softly. "I really do. But I don't know where to start." Darius placed a hand on Hank's shoulder. "Start by reflecting on your past behavior. Think about how you viewed others based on their race. It's not easy, but it's necessary." Hank nodded, his mind already racing back through years of police work. How many times had he made snap judgments based on someone's skin color? How many people had he treated unfairly without even realizing it? "I've been a cop for 20 years, Hank said, his voice thick with emotion. "I always thought I was doing the right thing, protecting people. But now I wonder how many times I've hurt people instead." Darius nodded, encouraging Hank to continue. "I remember this one time," Hank said, his eyes distant as he recalled the memory. "There was a group of black teenagers hanging out in the park after dark. I immediately assumed they were up to no good. Turns out they were just stargazing for a school project." Hank shook his head, disgusted with himself. "And that's just one example. There are probably hundreds more that I didn't even notice at the time." Darius listened patiently as Hank continued to open up about his past behaviors and biases. With each admission, Hank felt a mix of shame and relief. It was painful to confront these truths about himself, but he knew it was necessary. As Hank continued to reflect on his past mistakes, Darius's phone suddenly buzzed. The philanthropist's brow furrowed as he read the message on the screen. His expression shifted from concern to frustration, catching Hank's attention. Is everything okay, Mr. Jefferson? Hank asked, worry creeping into his voice. Darius sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. No, it's not, he replied, his usual composure slipping for a moment. I just received some troubling news about the community center project. Hank felt his heart sink. After everything he'd learned about Darius's efforts to help the town, he couldn't bear the thought of something going wrong. What happened? He asked softly. Bureaucratic red tape, Darius explained, his voice tinged with frustration. The contracts for the community center have been delayed. Several key approvals are still pending, and without them, we can't move forward with the construction. Hank's eyes widened in disbelief. But you've put so much work into this. Surely there's something that can be done. Darius shook his head, his gaze fixed on the construction site before them. These delays could jeopardize the entire project, he said, his voice heavy with concern. If we can't get those approvals soon, we might lose our funding, our contractors, everything. Hank watched as Darius's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of this setback clearly taking its toll. For the first time since they'd met, Hank saw vulnerability in the billionaire's eyes. It was a stark reminder that even someone as powerful and influential as Darius Jefferson could face obstacles beyond his control. I've worked so hard to make this happen, Darius said softly, almost to himself. This community center could change so many lives, and now it might all fall apart because of some paperwork. Hank felt a surge of empathy for Darius. He realized that this man, whom he had so terribly misjudged, was fighting not just against prejudice, but also against a system that seemed designed to hinder progress. Darius's frustration was palpable as he paced back and forth in front of the construction site. Hank watched him, feeling a mixture of concern and guilt. He had never seen the usually composed billionaire so visibly upset. I don't understand, Darius said, his voice strained. We've followed every regulation, dotted every I, and crossed every T. But somehow we're still stuck waiting for approvals that should have been granted weeks ago. Hank listened intently, beginning to grasp the complexity of the situation. Is there anything you can do to speed up the process? He asked gently. Darius shook his head, a sad smile on his face. I've tried everything, Hank. I've made calls, sent emails, even tried to set up meetings with the officials in charge. But it's like hitting a brick wall. They keep saying it's in process, but nothing changes. As Darius continued to share his frustrations, Hank felt a deep sense of empathy growing within him. He could see how much this project meant to Darius, how passionate he was about making a difference in the community. This center, Darius said, his voice softening, it's not just a building. It's hope for so many people who've never had it before. It's a chance for kids to have a safe place to learn and grow. It's an opportunity for adults to gain new skills and better their lives, and now all of that is hanging by a thread because of some bureaucratic nonsense. Hank's heart ached as he watched Darius's shoulders slump. He realized that this man, whom he had so terribly misjudged, was fighting not just against prejudice but also against a system that seemed designed to hinder progress. In that moment, something shifted inside Hank. He felt a strong urge to help, to do something, anything, to support Darius and this incredible project. This was his chance to make amends, to show Darius that he had truly changed, and to make a real difference in his community. Mr. Jefferson, Hank said, his voice filled with determination. I want to help. I know I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can do something to push this project forward. I've got connections in the local government. Maybe I can talk to some people, see if we can get those approvals moving. Darius looked at Hank, surprise evident in his eyes. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing Hank's offer, perhaps wondering if he could trust the man who had wronged him so recently. But then, a glimmer of hope appeared in his expression. You'd do that? Darius asked, his voice cautious but hopeful. Hank nodded firmly. Yes, sir, I would. This community center is too important to let it fail because of red tape. Let me see what I can do. Hank wasted no time in reaching out to his contacts. He pulled out his phone and started dialing numbers he hadn't used in years. Old friends from the police academy, city council members he'd helped during elections, and even a judge he'd known since childhood. Hank called them all. "Hey, Thomas," Hank said into the phone, his voice urgent but friendly. "I need a favor. It's about that new community center project." For the next few days, Hank worked tirelessly. He visited offices, made countless phone calls, and even showed up at a city council meeting to plead his case. At each turn, he explained the importance of the project and the impact it would have on their town. "This isn't just another building," Hank told a group of officials. "It's a chance to change lives. We can't let red tape stop something this important." As the days passed, Hank's efforts began to bear fruit. Approvals that had been stuck for weeks suddenly started moving forward. Signatures appeared on documents, and permits were granted with surprising speed. One sunny afternoon, as Hank and Darius stood at the construction site, Hank's phone buzzed. He answered it, listened intently, and then broke into a wide smile. "Mr. Jefferson," Hank said, his voice filled with excitement. "That was the city planner. The final approval just came through. We're good to go." Darius's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hank nodded, grinning from ear to ear. "Dead serious. The community center project is officially approved. Construction can start immediately." Darius stood there, stunned for a moment. Then, to Hank's surprise, the billionaire's eyes welled up with tears. "I can't believe it," Darius said, his voice thick with emotion. "Hank, I don't know how to thank you." Hank felt a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he felt truly proud of himself. He had done something good, something that would help countless people in his community. "No need to thank me, Mr. Jefferson," Hank said softly. "I'm just glad I could help make this happen." As they stood there looking out over the site where the community center would soon stand, Hank felt a profound sense of accomplishment. He had not only helped expedite the project, but had also taken a significant step in his own journey of growth and redemption. As Hank stood beside Darius, looking out over the future site of the community center, a wave of emotions washed over him. The past week had been a whirlwind of experiences that had shaken him to his core. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warm sun bathe his face as he reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. Just a week ago, Hank had been so sure of himself, so certain that he knew right from wrong. But now, as he looked back, he could see how deeply his prejudice had clouded his judgment. The memory of that day in the bank made him wince. He had been so quick to assume the worst, so ready to believe that Darius was a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. "I was so blind," Hank thought to himself, shaking his head slightly. He glanced at Darius, who was busy talking to a construction worker about the project plans. Hank marveled at how patient and kind Darius had been throughout this entire ordeal. Despite Hank's initial treatment of him, Darius had given him a chance to learn and grow. As Hank watched Darius interact with the workers, explaining his vision for the community center with passion and enthusiasm, he felt a newfound sense of purpose stirring within him. He realized that it wasn't enough to simply acknowledge his mistakes. He needed to take action to ensure that no one else in the community experienced the discrimination that Darius had faced. "I can do better," Hank thought, his resolve strengthening. "I have to do better. For Darius, for the community, and for myself." Hank's mind raced with ideas. He could organize sensitivity training for his fellow officers, work with local schools to promote diversity and inclusion, and use his position in the community to speak out against prejudice and discrimination. The possibilities seemed endless, and for the first time in a long while, Hank felt truly excited about the future. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the construction site, Hank felt a sense of peace settle over him. He looked at Darius again, this time seeing him not as a stranger or a suspect, but as a friend and a valuable member of the community. Hank realized that he was beginning to see the world through Darius's eyes, a world full of potential, where people could come together to build something beautiful and meaningful. As the golden light of the setting sun bathed the construction site, Darius turned to Hank with a thoughtful expression. He had watched the officer's transformation over the past week, noting the changes in his behavior and attitude. While Darius was still cautious, he couldn't deny that Hank had made significant strides. Officer Stevens, Darius began, his voice calm and measured. I want you to know that I see the effort you've put in this week. Your help with the community center approvals was invaluable. Hank's face lit up with a mixture of relief and pride. Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. I'm just glad I could help make things right. Darius nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It's a good start, Hank. But I need you to understand something important. Hank's expression grew serious as he listened intently. Change doesn't happen overnight, Darius continued, his dark eyes holding Hank's gaze. What you've done this week is commendable, but it's just the beginning of a long journey. Hank's shoulders slumped slightly as the weight of Darius's words sank in. He knew the billionaire was right, but part of him had hoped that his recent actions would be enough to erase his past mistakes. Darius placed a hand on Hank's shoulder, his touch firm but not unkind. Don't be discouraged, Hank. Recognizing the need for change is the first step. But now comes the hard part. You must continue to work on yourself every day. Hank nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. I understand, Mr. Jefferson. I know I have a lot more to learn and a long way to go. That's right, Darius agreed. It's not just about helping with one project or being nice for a week. It's about constantly examining your thoughts, challenging your assumptions, and actively working to be better. Hank took a deep breath, absorbing Darius's words. He realized that this was just the beginning of a lifelong commitment to growth and change. I'm willing to put in the work, Mr. Jefferson, Hank said, his voice filled with determination. I don't want to be the person I was before. I want to be someone who makes this community better for everyone. Darius smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. That's good to hear, Hank. Remember, it won't always be easy. There will be times when old habits try to creep back in. But if you stay committed to this path, you can make a real difference. As they stood there looking out over the future site of the community center, both men felt a sense of hope for what was to come. Darius, though still guarded, appreciated Hank's sincere efforts to change. And Hank, humbled by the experience, was ready to embark on the challenging journey of personal growth that lay ahead. In the days following his conversation with Darius, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more. The community center project had opened his eyes to the real needs of the town, and he felt a burning desire to contribute in a meaningful way. One evening, as Hank sat at his kitchen table, an idea struck him like a bolt of lightning. He would organize a surprise community fundraiser for the center. His heart raced with excitement as he began to formulate a plan. The next morning, Hank woke up early, determined to put his idea into action. He started by reaching out to local businesses he had known for years. At first, some were skeptical, but as Hank passionately explained the importance of the project and Darius's contributions to the town, he saw their expressions soften. You should have seen the plans for this place, Hank said to Mrs. Johnson, the owner of the local bakery. It's going to change lives, give kids a safe place to go after school, help folks get job training. We can't let this opportunity slip away. Mrs. Johnson nodded, a smile spreading across her face. You're right, Hank. Count me in. I'll donate some baked goods for the fundraiser. Encouraged by this early success, Hank pressed on. He approached his fellow officers at the police station, many of whom were surprised by his newfound enthusiasm. Listen up, guys, Hank addressed them during a morning briefing. I know I haven't always been the best at seeing the big picture, but this community center is something we all need to get behind. It's not just about helping one group, it's about making our whole town stronger. To Hank's surprise and delight, his colleagues began to nod in agreement. Officer Martinez spoke up. You're right, Hank. What can we do to help? As word spread about Hank's efforts, more and more community members reached out, offering their support. The local diner promised to cater the event, while the high school drama club volunteered to provide entertainment. Hank's genuine passion for the cause was infectious. People who had never given much thought to community projects before found themselves caught up in his enthusiasm. Even those who had been wary of Hank in the past couldn't help but be moved by his sincerity. As the plans for the fundraiser came together, Hank felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. He was no longer just enforcing the law. He was actively working to make his community a better place for everyone. The day of the fundraiser finally arrived, and Hank's heart raced with a mix of excitement and nerves. As he approached the town square, he was amazed to see the transformation. Colorful banners hung from lampposts, and the air buzzed with lively chatter and laughter. People from all walks of life milled about, dropping donations into collection boxes and participating in various activities. The aroma of Mrs. Johnson's freshly baked goods wafted through the air, drawing people to her booth. Children giggled as they played games organized by the local youth center, while adults engaged in animated conversations about the community center's potential impact. Hank's fellow officers were there too, helping to manage the crowd and participating in the festivities. He felt a surge of pride seeing his colleagues so involved in the community event. As the afternoon wore on, the master of ceremonies announced that it was time for speeches. Hank's palms began to sweat as he realized his moment had come. He hadn't prepared anything formal, deciding instead to speak from the heart. Taking a deep breath, Hank stepped up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on him. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "Folks, I'm not much for public speaking," he started, his voice a bit shaky. "But I've got something important to say. A week ago, I made a terrible mistake. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I hurt someone who has done nothing but good for our town." Hank paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw Darius standing at the back, watching him intently. "I've spent the past week learning from Mr. Darius Jefferson," Hank continued, his voice growing stronger. "And let me tell you, it's been an eye-opening experience. I've seen firsthand the incredible work he's doing, the lives he's changing, and I realized something: I was part of the problem." A hush fell over the crowd as Hank's words sank in. "But here's the thing," Hank said, a small smile forming on his lips. "It's never too late to change. It's never too late to learn and grow. That's what this community center is all about. Giving people second chances, helping them become better versions of themselves." Hank's voice cracked with emotion as he continued. "I stand before you today, not as the same man I was a week ago, but as someone who's trying to be better. Someone who's learned that our differences don't divide us. They make us stronger when we come together." As Hank finished his speech, the crowd erupted in applause. Many had tears in their eyes, moved by his honesty and vulnerability. Hank stepped down from the podium, his heart full of gratitude for the second chance he'd been given. As the applause faded, Darius made his way through the crowd towards Hank. The officer stood nervously at the edge of the stage, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure. The crowd parted, sensing the importance of this moment. Darius reached Hank, his face a mixture of emotions. For a moment, they stood face to face, the weight of the past week hanging between them. Then, to everyone's surprise, Darius extended his hand. "Hank," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "I want to thank you for your honesty and courage today. It takes a big man to admit his mistakes, and an even bigger one to work on changing them." Hank, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, grasped Darius's hand firmly. "Mr. Jefferson, But Darius wasn't finished. "What you've done here today, organizing this fundraiser, speaking from your heart, it shows me that you're truly committed to change. And for that, I forgive you completely." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Hank stood stunned, barely able to process the words he'd just heard. Forgiveness. It was more than he'd dared to hope for. Overwhelmed with emotion, Hank struggled to find words. "Thank you," he managed to choke out. "I promise I'll keep working to be better, to do better." Darius nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. Then, in a gesture that took everyone by surprise, he opened his arms wide. Hank hesitated for just a moment before stepping forward into Darius's embrace. The two men hugged tightly, their reconciliation a powerful symbol of hope and unity for the entire community. As they stood there, the silence broke into thunderous applause. People cheered, whistled, and some even wiped away tears. As Hank and Darius separated, both men had tears in their eyes. Hank felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. The weight of guilt he'd been carrying for the past week seemed to lift from his shoulders. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, his neighbors, friends, and colleagues, and saw not judgment, but acceptance and support. For the first time in days, Hank allowed himself to smile. He had been given a second chance, an opportunity to make things right and to be a force for positive change in his community. As he stood there beside Darius with the cheers of the crowd ringing in his ears, Hank silently vowed to make the most of this precious gift. Weeks turned into months. The sun shone brightly on the day of the community center's grand opening. A large crowd had gathered in front of the gleaming new building, its fresh paint and modern design a beacon of hope for the neighborhood. Colorful balloons bobbed in the gentle breeze, and a long red ribbon stretched across the entrance. At the center of it all stood Darius Jefferson and Hank Stevens, side by side. The unlikely pair had become a symbol of transformation and unity in the community. Hank, dressed in his police uniform, looked around in awe at the sea of faces, young and old from all walks of life, who had come to celebrate this momentous occasion. Darius stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice filled with warmth and pride. "Today marks a new beginning for our community," he said. "This center is more than just a building. It's a place of opportunity, growth, and connection." As Darius spoke, Hank felt a lump form in his throat. He remembered the day he had wrongfully accused this man and how that terrible mistake had led to an incredible journey of personal growth and community transformation. Now, here they were, standing together as friends and partners in making their town a better place. When it came time for the ribbon cutting, Darius motioned for Hank to join him. Together they grasped the oversized scissors, their hands overlapping on the handle. With a shared nod, they cut through the red ribbon, officially opening the doors of the new community center. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. As people began to file into the building, Hank caught sight of familiar faces. The youth from Darius's mentoring program, the ex-offenders from the rehabilitation center, and many others whose lives would be touched by this new resource. Hank felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Darius smiling at him. "We did it, Hank," Darius said softly. "This wouldn't have been possible without you." Overwhelmed with emotion, Hank could only nod. He felt an immense sense of pride, not just in the building before them, but in how far he had come. He had played a part in making this project a reality, and in doing so, had become a better version of himself. As they walked into the center together, Hank marveled at the bustling activity around them. Children were already exploring the new library, seniors were gathering in the community room, and young adults were checking out the job training facilities. The center was alive with possibility, and Hank knew that countless lives would be changed within these walls. In the months following the community center's grand opening, Hank Stevens found himself spending more and more time there. He had traded in his patrol shifts for community outreach work, dedicating himself to making a real difference in the town he had sworn to protect. One sunny afternoon, Hank sat across from Darius in the center's bustling cafeteria. They were deep in conversation about the police force's latest recruitment drive. "We need to do more to attract diverse candidates," Hank said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Our force should reflect the community we serve." Darius nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm glad to hear you say that, Hank. It's a big step in the right direction." Hank's cheeks flushed slightly. "I've learned a lot from you, Darius. I want to make sure others have the chance to learn too." As they continued their discussion, a group of teenagers entered the cafeteria. Hank's eyes lit up as he recognized them from his mentoring program. He waved them over, introducing them to Darius with pride. "These are some of our brightest young minds," Hank said, beaming. "They're all interested in law enforcement careers." The teenagers gathered around, eager to meet Darius and share their aspirations. Hank listened intently as they spoke, offering words of encouragement and advice. He couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the future of his town and its police force. Later that week, Hank found himself standing before a room full of fellow officers at the police station. He had been invited to speak about his experiences and the importance of community engagement. "I used to think I knew this town inside and out," Hank began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I was wrong. I had blind spots, prejudices I didn't even realize I had. It took a wake-up call for me to see it." He paused, looking around at the faces of his colleagues. Some nodded in understanding, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "But here's the thing," Hank continued. It's never too late to change. We have a responsibility to do better, to be better, and it starts with each one of us. As Hank spoke about his journey and the work he was doing at the community center, he could see a change coming over the room. Officers who had initially seemed skeptical were now leaning forward, engaged in his words. By the end of his talk, several officers approached Hank, expressing interest in getting involved with the community center's programs. Hank felt a surge of pride, knowing that his transformation was having a ripple effect throughout the department. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the community center, Hank and Darius stood side by side on the front steps. They watched as families and individuals of all ages and backgrounds streamed in and out of the building, each person touched in some way by the center's programs and services. Hank turned to Darius, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. You know, Darius, I never thought I'd be standing here like this. Not after how we started. Darius nodded, a gentle smile on his face. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? But it's what we do with those surprises that really matters. Hank's gaze swept over the bustling community center, taking in the laughter of children in the playground and the earnest conversations of adults attending job training sessions. This place, it's changed so many lives, including mine. It's not just the place, Hank, Darius said, placing a hand on Hank's shoulder. It's the people who make it what it is. People like you, who are willing to learn and grow. Hank's eyes misted over slightly. I've got a long way to go, Darius, but I promise you I'll keep learning, I'll keep growing, and I'll always stand up for what's right, no matter how tough it gets. Darius squeezed Hank's shoulder. That's all anyone can ask for, my friend. And look at what we've accomplished already. This town, it's becoming a better place, day by day, person by person. As they stood there, a young girl ran up to them, her eyes bright with excitement. Officer Hank, Mr. Jefferson, are you coming to the talent show next week? I'm going to sing. Hank knelt down to her level, his face breaking into a wide grin. We wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart. Darius and I will be right there in the front row. As the girl skipped away, Hank stood up, sharing a look of understanding with Darius. In that moment, both men felt the deep bond of friendship and mutual respect that had grown between them. Darius looked out at the town stretching before them, its streets now filled with a new sense of unity and purpose. You know, Hank, when I first came here, I had hopes for this place, but what we've achieved, it's beyond anything I could have imagined. Hank nodded, his voice filled with determination. And we're just getting started, aren't we? As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, Hank and Darius stood together, their hearts full of hope and optimism for the future. They had come so far, and yet, they knew that their journey was far from over. But with each passing day, with each life touched and changed, they were building a better tomorrow, not just for themselves, but for everyone in their town. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Hank and Darius, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.